As you move around in the world, you regularly come across signs, posters, and images that tell you about things that you can or cannot do, or things that you are required to do. For example, you might sit down to watch a movie on DVD or Blu-ray, and a screen will come up that tells you that unauthorized reproduction or distribution is illegal and subject to fines and imprisonment. Or you might take a walk through your neighborhood and see a sign that says that all dog owners must pick up any dog waste. Under the institutional grammar, originally proposed by Sue Crawford and Eleanor Ostrom in 1995, these instructions about what you must, can, or cannot do are called institutional statements. According to Franz and Siddiqui, developers of the Institutional Grammar 2.0, quote, institutional statements describe actions for actors within particular contexts, or parameterize features of an institutional system within particular contexts. The institutional grammar provides an approach for analyzing the structure and meaning of institutional statements. Institutional statements can be either regulative or constitutive. Regulative statements are just that. They regulate actions by telling someone, a person, a business, a government entity, what they can, cannot, or must do in a particular circumstance. Constitutive statements, on the other hand, define features of a system. The institutional grammar can be used to analyze both regulative and constitutive statements, though in slightly different ways. Let's look at an example of each, starting with a regulative statement. Commuters may drive electric vehicles in the high occupancy vehicle lane only after 5 p.m. Regulative statements have 6 components: attributes, aim, context, object, deontic, and or else. The attributes component identifies the actor in the regulative statement. In other words, the actor that is doing or not doing something. In our example, the attributes is the commuters. The aim is the action that the regulative statement wants an actor to take, or the outcome that it wants to achieve. In our example, the regulative statement is telling commuters that they can drive in the high occupancy vehicle lane. From this, we can infer that the goal of the regulative statement is to incentivize commuters to switch to electric vehicles. The context refers to the circumstances under which a regulative statement applies. The context might include such factors as time of day, location, or a specific process or procedure. The context can be further classified into one of 2 categories: activation conditions and execution constraints. Activation conditions are the criteria that must be met for the institutional statement to take effect. Execution constraints, meanwhile, are any qualifiers imposed on the activities described in the institutional statement. Our regulative statement has both an activation condition and an execution constraint. Our regulative statement takes effect only after 5 p.m. If an electric vehicle owner is on the road at 8 o'clock in the morning, then they cannot drive in the high occupancy vehicle lane. The phrase only after 5 p.m. then is our activation condition. In the high occupancy vehicle lane, meanwhile, is our execution constraint. The regulative statement regulates driving in that lane and that lane only, and imposes no rules or restrictions about driving in any other lane. The attributes, aim, and context are considered necessary components to any regulative statement. In addition to these, there are 3 other components that a regulative statement can have, but does not need to have. We refer to these as sufficient components. The first of these is the object. The object is whatever or whoever is impacted by the regulative statement. Objects can be impacted either directly, in which case we refer to them as direct objects, or indirectly, indirect objects. In our example, the electric vehicles are a direct object, since the statement impacts where they may or may not be driven. The deontic tells us whether the regulative statement imposes a requirement, permission, or prohibition for any given activity. In our example, the deontic takes the form of permission. Commuters may. Lastly, the or else spells out the consequence that goes into effect if the regulative statement is not followed. Our regulative statement does not have an or else, but we could add a clause saying that violators will face a fine of $100. Now that we have analyzed a regulative statement, let's look at an example of a constitutive statement. Once established in the Department of Transportation, the competitive grant program includes funding initiatives to support installation of electric vehicle charging stations. Constitutive statements also have 6 components, some of which are the same as regulative statements: constituted entity, constitutive function, context, constituting property, modal, and or else. The constituted entity is the entity being constituted, reconstituted, modified, or otherwise directly affected by the constitutive statement. In our example, the constituted entity is the grant program. The constitutive function links the constituted entity to the larger institutional setting. In other words, the constitutive function typically tells us what is happening to the constituted entity. In this case, the grant program is including something. The context is the same as under a regulative statement. It identifies the circumstances under which a constitutive statement applies. And just as in a regulative statement, the context can be classified as either an activation condition or an execution constraint. In our example, we have an activation condition. The grant must first be established in the Department of Transportation. The constituted entity, constitutive function, and context are the necessary components of a constitutive statement. Like a regulative statement, a constitutive statement also has 3 sufficient components. The constituting property links the constituted entity to the constitutive function. In our example, the funding initiatives are the constituting property. They are the thing that the grant program is including. The modal specifies whether the constitutive statement includes a requirement. It's sort of like the deontic in a regulative statement, but instead of telling us whether a certain action is or is not required, the modal tells us whether the entity being constituted may exist or must exist. Our constitutive statement does not have a modal, but we could modify it by saying the grant program may include funding initiatives, or that it must include them. Finally, the or else identifies the consequences that result if the constitutive function is not carried out. Once again, our constitutive statement does not have an or else, but we could add a clause saying that or else funding for installation will be unavailable. At this point, you might ask yourself, why does institutional grammar matter? Institutional grammar is an important tool for breaking down an institutional statement into its component parts, as well as identifying the relationships between those parts. We can use the institutional grammar to figure out what an institutional statement wants someone to do, whether it's required or optional, to whom it applies, under what circumstances, and penalties for non-compliance. But all of this is just one aspect of the institutional grammar. In addition to syntax, the structure of an institutional statement, the institutional grammar also provides a basis for understanding semantics, how an institutional statement is read or interpreted, and pragmatics, how an institutional statement is applied in practice. And here we can see the real-world consequences of institutional grammar. Take, for example, the Paris Climate Accords. In 2022, researchers from Lund University in Finland looked at 36 developing nations and the extent to which they were on track to meet the goals outlined in the Paris Climate Accords. They apply the institutional grammar both to institutional statements found within the Accords, as well as within nationally determined contributions that the 36 countries had developed for how they planned on complying with the Accords. In both cases, the researchers distinguished between institutional statements that required countries to meet a certain climate target versus statements that merely outlined suggested targets. The researchers found that developing countries were more likely to commit themselves to meeting these suggested targets, and that there was comparatively less initiative when it came to implementing the required targets. The institutional grammar, then, can help us evaluate the extent to which countries are committed to taking action to combat climate change. So, while it may seem abstract at first, the institutional grammar has huge consequences for the rules and policies that govern our daily lives and how they are applied.